All right, we're going to start our unit on the Great Depression off with a bang, or with gunfire at the very least. We're going to take a look at the FBI and the era of public enemies that start to become um, prevalent in the 1930s. So, buckle up and let's take a look. You're going to hear some famous names that you already know in here. We've got some cool stories about crime in the 1930s. Now, today we know the FBI as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's something that is on in movies, on television shows, things like that. The actual FBI gets its start in 1908. This man is the Attorney General for the United States in 1908. The Attorney General is the head of our Department of Justice, and he was looking to put together a federal kind of police force, for lack of a better term, somebody to a centralized group to work on federal crimes. He'd gotten some inspiration from groups like the Pinkerton Detectives, who had a lot of success in the 1800s and early 1900s tracking down criminals because they had offices in multiple cities in the United States. And so they were able to work together to try and find people, solve crimes, that sort of thing. And so that's what they're going to try and do with the FBI. The people that work for the FBI get a certain image very quickly. They are nicknamed G-men for government men. That comes from the fellow whose picture you see there on the left. That's Machine Gun Kelly. If you've ever heard of him, very famous criminal from the 1930s. Supposedly he was in a shootout with federal agents, runs out of bullets, which I'm sure was embarrassing for a man named Machine Gun. And when he runs out of bullets, he throws his hands up and yells, "Don't shoot, G-men, don't shoot," by way of surrendering. And so the name kind of stuck. Now, we've had a lot of images of these types of federal agents over the years. Top right-hand corner there, you've got Dick Tracy, who's an early comic strip character. There's been a Dick Tracy movie. There are comic books and things like that. He was basically a detective for the police force that had all these cool little gizmos that he could use. Kind of had, if you're interested, look in. They had kind of anticipated the Apple Watch, 50 years or more, even before the Apple Watch was even thought of. He had a wearable that allowed him to communicate with the police station, that sort of thing. Eventually, we get to the point where these federal agents are spoofed, kind of famously with Get Smart. Maxwell Smart was a secret agent, had all these crazy things like a shoe phone, those sorts of things. And Steve Carell made a remake movie of the old 60s television show. Now when we think of G's, we've got like Jay-Z, right? Back in the day, it was government men. It was these federal agents. Kind of the prototypical guy for this is a guy named Eliot Ness. Now, Eliot Ness is the man who will take down Al Capone in the city of Chicago in the 1930s. He was actually a prohibition officer, what today we would call the ATF. He was enforcing prohibition laws, which were prevalent in the 20s and the early 30s. Like a lot of people in Chicago, Al Capone tried to bribe Eliot Ness basically to look the other way for his illegal actions. Eliot Ness wouldn't take the bait. He ended up collecting a small group of guys that will eventually take down Al Capone. Al Capone referred to them as the Untouchables. It was a great movie by Brian De Palma starring Kevin Costner called The Untouchables, if you're interested in the story of how that went down. He works with the FBI, but not for the FBI. But this image, the guys in the three-piece suit, the vest with the kind of the black or navy blue or gray suit with the fedoras, becomes this image that people get of government agents in the 1920s and 30s. The most famous director of the FBI is this guy. His name is J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is the man responsible for turning the FBI into what it is today. He becomes director of the FBI before it's even referred to as the FBI. It's in 1924. If you look at that, those dates are not the dates where he was alive. Those are the dates he was the director of the FBI. So he's going to be the director of the FBI for almost 50 years. You don't get to have that job without knowing a thing or two about fighting crime, but also knowing a thing or two about how to play politics. And we'll talk about how he does that in a second. J. Edgar, it's another movie I've got in the film library. It's got Leo DiCaprio in it, playing the title character. And it talks about this guy's rise to power and the ways that he used the FBI to really become kind of a modern crime-fighting force. This is the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned before, he kind of had a dress code for the people that were going to be working for the FBI. You were expected to look good. He is also one of the first guys to say, hey, you know what we ought to do? We ought to start to use science to try and fight crime. Things like fingerprinting become common practice in Hoover's FBI. Anything he could use to get an edge in crime investigation, he was willing to try it out and to use it. Now, like I said before, today I think the FBI director gets 6-year terms. It's appointed by the president. So how in the world does this guy get to be FBI director for almost 50 years? Well, the rumor was that he had a number of secret files. Basically that he had not only files on criminals, but files on important people around the country and in Washington, D.C. especially. And because of these secret files, everybody was afraid to cross him because he kind of knew their deepest, darkest secrets. And the famous story gets told that when John Kennedy is elected president of the United States, that he wants Hoover fired. So he sends his brother, who's the Attorney General, the head of the Department of Justice, over to fire J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover's waiting on him, and as Robert Kennedy starts to tell him what's going on, Hoover supposedly takes a file out of the file cabinet and starts to throw pictures on the desk in front of Robert Kennedy. These pictures are of President John Kennedy and a whole bunch of women who aren't Jackie Kennedy. Robert Kennedy is supposed to have become incensed, can't believe he's threatening the President of the United States, and then Hoover says, would you like to see your file? Now, whether that happens or not, there were a lot of people that didn't like Hoover, but he kept power until the day he died. He dies as the director of the FBI, and he had a longtime secretary who'd worked for him for years and years, and her instruction when she found out he was dead was to burn the secret files. And so people rushed over to Hoover's office to try and get their hands on these, but she destroyed them by the time that they got there, which is kind of disappointing because there was probably some pretty cool history in those files. But I'm willing to bet there would have been a lot of people willing to do a lot of things to make sure their files didn't get out. Now, Hoover benefits from an era of crime that springs up in the 20s and 30s. We talked about Prohibition when we talked about the 1920s, and the idea that making alcohol illegal opened up a revenue stream for people who were willing to skirt the law, and it leads to early organized crime. Well, the Great Depression leads to another group of people who are going to come in, and it leads us into what's called the public enemy era. And so public enemy number one today is kind of the criminal that they would most like to catch. These folks that we're going to see are public enemies. This picture is of the Barker Gang, and so you can see kind of the fashion of the 1930s that's there. You've got men and women who are involved in this type of crime. So let's look real quick at a couple of these celebrity criminals. Um, Crime becomes national news in the early part of the 1930s with the kidnapping of this child. This is Charles Lindbergh Jr. You got to remember that name from our 1920s visuals. Charles Lindbergh was a famous aviator, right? He's that guy that made that solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1920s. Well, he marries, and he and his wife have a small child. And when the child is 20 months old, the child is kidnapped from the Lindbergh home. There's a nursery on the second story. These are wealthy people. They had a nanny who took care of their son. She goes to check on him and finds the child is gone. They call the police, of course, and as they call the police start to investigate and find evidence that somebody has taken a ladder, climbed into the window, stolen the child, and absconded with him. Near the window is a $50,000 ransom note that says the kidnappers will be in touch. Well, this sets off a national sensation. People are obviously knew who Charles Lindbergh was. He's maybe the most famous man in the United States at this point. And so people are trying to help. People are trying to cash in. There's just a lot of different things that are going on surrounding this kidnapping. Franklin Roosevelt will eventually ask the FBI to kind of gather up all of these different people who are trying to find things and lead the investigation. And so there's a great deal of fame that comes with the FBI and Hoover because they're leading this search for the Lindbergh baby. Tragically, the Lindbergh baby's found like 4 months after his kidnapping. He'd been murdered and buried in the woods like 4 or 5 miles away from the family home. But what this had showed was the FBI was capable of conducting a national investigation into certain crimes. There are going to be criminals, though, that start to capture attention in the area of the country we live in the Midwest. One group was called the Barker Gang, famously led by this lady. Her name was Ma Barker. Real name is Katie, but they refer to her as Ma Barker. She supposedly helped her sons and then his friends commit crimes. They were big into kidnapping. And so basically they would kidnap somebody hold them for ransom until they got paid and then release that person. One of the cool things the FBI was able to do was to track these people and who was responsible because they had figured out that everyone has unique fingerprints. And with a little substance called silver nitrate, that they were able to lift fingerprints off of ransom notes that were being sent. So we see an instance here of new crime-fighting techniques and technologies being used to solve some of these crimes. My favorite quote from this area is by a guy named Willie Sutton. An awful lot of these folks are going to rob banks. That became a big deal, was to rob banks. And somebody asked Willie Sutton, Willie, why did you rob all those banks? And he famously says, because that's where the money is. Now keep in mind, this is the era of the Great Depression. For a lot of regular people, they look at the banks as being at least partially responsible for the economic mess they're in. Maybe they had money in banks and lost it when it collapsed. And so for a lot of regular people, they didn't care to see these criminals kind of stick it to the banks. They thought the banks may have deserved what it was that they were getting. You got Babyface Nelson, who is a famous bank robber here. You can see this picture. He does look like a young guy. He's like 87 in this picture. I'm just kidding. I don't know how old he is in that picture. But taken in 1931, he was a member of the John Dillinger gang, who has an Indiana connection. We'll talk about him in a few minutes. This guy killed more FBI agents than any other criminal in the 1930s. Famously, this couple, Bonnie and Clyde, do kind of the same thing. They were bank robbers, were accused of murdering 12 to 15 officers of the law, doing all kinds of crimes at this time. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were their names. They actually met when Clyde was 21 and Bonnie was 19. Bonnie was actually married, runs off on her husband for Clyde. Clyde was in jail when they met, and she snuck him in a machine gun and got him out of jail, which is a super romantic first date, I think. Clyde gets captured again, but he was really good at escaping. One of the things they would do, if you've ever seen those cartoons where they'd have the like the ball and chain that they would put on somebody's foot to keep him from running away, Clyde actually chopped off his own little toe to make his foot be able to fit through one of those things and get the ball and chain off. So you got a dedicated guy there, and these two are going to go around the country, basically robbing banks. They are captured. There was a great Netflix movie, maybe a year and a half ago that came out. It's got Kevin Costner in it. You may search. That follows the story of two federal agents searching for Bonnie and Clyde. They eventually find out where they're going to be. They ambush them, and they will shoot the car Bonnie and Clyde are in 130 times, obviously killing both Bonnie and Clyde, and really making a mess of that car. Nobody's going to be able to drive that one again. But this was a couple who captured the imagination of the public as this era was happening. John Dillinger is our last guy we want to see. Again, there are tons of these guys. If it's something you're interested in, I encourage you to take a look. He was referred to as Robin Hood with better tricks. He got this. He robbed banks, but he got this reputation because sometimes he would give money that he had robbed to just regular people. One time when he robbed a bank, supposedly he tells everybody to get down on the ground. People start to pull out their wallets and purses to give him the money. He supposedly looked at the lady and said, "No, ma'am, I'm not here for your money. I'm here for the bank's money." Now, the problem is it's actually your money that is the bank's money. But that's neither here nor there. Like I said, people didn't like banks a whole lot because they were getting blamed for what had gone on with the banking collapse in the Great Depression. So these folks knew each other, sometimes worked together. Dillinger, like I said, had an Indiana connection. They actually used to, in Plainfield, Indiana, have a John Dillinger Museum because he famously broke out of a couple of different jails in Indiana, once with a bar of soap that he had carved into the shape of a gun and then painted black with shoe polish. Just all kinds of cool stories like that. I've got a biography of John Dillinger I'm going to throw up on the playlist. I encourage you to take a look at it. It's just kind of cool to see the types of things that this guy was doing. He is caught. He had a on-again, off-again girlfriend who the FBI get to, and they tell her basically, you need to tell us where John Dillinger's going to be, or we're going to take away your kid. She had a small child, and so she agrees that she'll set Dillinger up to be at a movie theater in Chicago, and she will be wearing a red dress. And so they go to the movies. When they come out, John Dillinger is shot and killed. And so this era is full of these kinds of stories. Public Enemies was a movie that Johnny Depp was in several years ago. Again, a copy conveniently located in the film library for you. But this is a time of kind of the romanticized criminal, and there are all kinds of examples of that that you can take a look at. Today, the FBI obviously is still around. One of the easiest ways to get into the FBI, they say, is to get a degree in accounting, because an awful lot of this is investigating, following money, and those sorts of things. What I've got listed here for you are the types of things that the FBI is going to be searching for or kind of be involved in different ways. Probably the most famous thing the FBI does is they have a 10 most wanted list of fugitives. If you go to FBI.gov, there are you can see these things and see a little bit about what these guys have done. It may have even changed even since I got this picture to put in here. They're always looking for folks, and these guys commit just a variety of different crimes. But these 10 most wanted are folks that the FBI is currently looking for one reason or another. So again, encourage you to visit that website, go to the playlist, check out the videos that I've linked there if you want to learn some more about J. Edgar Hoover and these celebrity criminals.